Hey guys, so of course we just had YCS Bologna conclude, so as usual I wanted to provide an overview of the most played hand traps and staples that were played on the topping list that were available. So definitely before I continue, huge thanks to my sponsors as always. Go check out those discount codes that I'll have in the video description for Yu-Gi-Oh singles as well as supplies. So now this is the pie chart of the topping decks I included for this particular video, which involved 45 deck lists out of the top 64, and so definitely a huge shout out as always to YGOProDeck.com in terms of having all that amazing resources, and also Ivan as well for the spreadsheet. So I'll have all those links down below, but for the most part I think the pie chart more or less represents what the exact or what the actual top cut was, but not entirely, right? So just keep that in mind. Some of the most played hand traps or staples may be relevant based on which decks were actually available for analysis. So in terms of a quick overview of the number of hand traps, it actually ranged from 0 to 16 with a median of 9 hand traps in the main, which is actually the same as the last time I did this. I think that was Richmond, right, last month. And so 9 is honestly quite a high number. If you kind of saw my old history by the data analysis video, number of hand traps typically I think is around 6, 7. And then next in terms of the side deck, median of 6, and this is also pretty in line with what we just saw last month as well. So not much has actually changed this time around, and it is a big hand trap format. In terms of going second board breakers, median number was 3, which again is actually just about the same as last month as well. But in the side deck, it was actually a little bit higher at 5 last time around. Last month I believe it was still around 3 board breakers, so a little bit extra in this time around. Now in terms of the most common hand traps that were played among the topping deck lists that were publicly available, we're actually starting out with Nibiru. Last time it was Droll, which in itself is usually, for the most part, it's always Ash is number 1, but this time around we are still in a format where I guess Ash is not the most played hand trap. Nibiru of course is very good. I was a little surprised it was still the most played hand trap among the lists that were available at least, just because sure it's good against Unchained I guess, but let's say against Tearlaments it can be good, but if they have a name up, let's say I don't know, Sharon, they can still trigger a fusion, kind of keep playing from there. Against something like Labrynth, obviously it's not very good. Against Purrely it doesn't come up unless they're getting kind of greedy. Against Fire Kings I don't believe it comes up either, and against Centur-ion they usually do things in 4 summons. I think if they play the horse stuff they might play into it, but nonetheless I think it is a card that you still have to respect, but I was still a little bit surprised that was number 1. And then we have Ash, speaking of usual number 1. I mean, it's such a good card in terms of just how much it can hit, right? You have decks let's say Tearlaments, I guess, as long as they don't chain block something on, Ash on a Guido or Kelba can be really, really strong, or even a Sharon to prevent them from snowballing. You have something like Rescue Ace and Emergency, any branded deck and branded fusion, as well as something like Labrynth, Big Welcome, Labrynth, whatever. So it can be really good. Even some new decks let's say Fire Kings, I believe on Ponix can be really good as well. Against Centur-ion, I don't think it's that amazing, but at least it can still hit pretty much every deck out there. And then you also have Imperm, which has been seeing a lot of play in terms of effect negation, just because of Turbulence being able to set 4, and Imperm is always nice because it can be used going second as well, and also can potentially shut down Floodgate if you happen to set it as well, so it can really come up as well. So I think it's fairly strong. Droll, surprisingly, saw a bit of a decline I think this time around. I mean, it's still something I think most decks probably will want to run, just out of the fear of, let's say, something like Mannadium, which I don't think actually topped, or at least maybe they were in that other 10 decks that weren't really identified. But those decks, yes, you really need Droll, or you're probably losing. Even something let's say Infernoble, Mikanko, Droll can be also really good, except they typically or may play Aqua Dolphin, right, and hand rip that out. So that's kind of unfortunate, but for the most part it is. It's also actually seen mostly in the side, 5 decks playing in the main, and something maybe you can consider in terms of your maybe game 1 you can play a little greedy, I'm not sure, but at least that's something. And then also effect failure, I already spoke about the effect negation, and so something like Imperm and a Veiler on something like Turbulence can be very good. Veiler is also kind of nice because it's something that you can draw off, let's say Purrely decks, they can draw it and then still be able to play it on the opponent's turn, whereas Imperm will probably be dead because you obviously have some cards on the field. Also forgot to mention that something like Imperm and Veiler can also be really good against something like Centur-ion as well, just because they rely on being able to set up their play for Synchro on your opponent's turn for that Calamity Lock. And then moving on, we have just kind of Bestials in general. Druid's Worm was actually played a little bit more than Magma. We've kind of seen that lately, especially because of its send effect as well. So I'm not going to put Magma on top of it as well, but Bestials are still seeing play. I think there was only one Dragon Link deck that topped, so really most of this number is not coming from that deck. It's just actually other decks are siding this as well. You have something like DD Crow, kind of to the similar effect of Bestials, just being able to banish is also really nice. And the plus side of this is that it doesn't have to be like a monster or a dark or light monster in that, so you can get rid of whatever Purrely spell that the Purrely monster was targeting, or let's say even something like Fire Kings. Now they are fire, so you can't use Bestials on them, but DD Crow can go kind of hard because they do tend to float a lot from the graveyard as well. And even something like Insect, Centur-ion, Bestials and Crow can also be good because they try to place like a Centur-ion card into the spell trap zone at the end phase as well. Next we have Phantasmate. This is interesting. We of course saw this also in Joshua Schmidt's first place list as well, so huge congrats to him, of course. So this card kind of saw a bit of play again a few months ago, actually, when like Unchained and Dragonlink were really dominant. This is around like the time of YCS Vancouver. Phantasmate, of course, it originally saw actually a lot of play back in 2019. It was a really expensive card, actually, the most expensive card at the time, actually, and because we were under Master Rule 4 and you were essentially kind of forced to link someone for any deck. Since Master Rule 5, this card definitely tanked in terms of play and price, but it does have application in terms of just being able to draw those really high impact hand traps, as Josh mentioned, in terms of Droll or Nibiru, for example. So can be really good, just really format dependent though. And then you have something like Ghost Mourner, of course, again, similar to the lines of Valor and Imperm, just like targeting negation, just for the most part, like something like Turbulent. It's also level 3 tuner, which maybe comes up, like, I don't know, if you're playing like Cashier, for example, you can make like Barone plays or like other Synchro 10 plays as well. And then you have Shifter, which actually did not see that much play. Of course, as I say, this kind of breakdown really depends on the type of decks that were included as part of this video. We did not have a lot of Flunder, for example, right? Because there weren't really any tops for Flunder. At the same time, you typically saw decks like, let's say, Purrely or Rescue AC, even they would like side Shifter, just because even though they don't play optimally under it, they can at least, it absolutely destroys Tearlaments, so that it was worthwhile siding. But even accounting for that, they actually still did not play Shifter that much this time around. So now let's just move on to the staples, and we are starting with Feather Duster as usual. It's usually number 1, although 32 of 45 lists playing it, so it wasn't actually all that unanimous in terms of playing it. I mean, there's no drawbacks to it, and just being able to clear back row is always nice. I guess something like Tearlaments, though, of course, they're going to be able to plus off the traps that you destroy, but sometimes you might not really have a choice because you really struggle against their back row. Against Rescue Ace, it also can be nice, just clearing that out. And against Labrynth, it's kind of iffy, because a lot of times nowadays, I think they kind of transition towards, like a lot of just more so chainable traps, right? Like D-Barrier, like, and whatever your big welcomes. But you know what? There were still some lists playing like stuff like Dogmatica Punishment, for example, which can really can add to the gameplay as well. So next we have Talents, which of course is seeing a lot of play lately, and especially in combination with something like, Ken and Jen, which you typically see in something like Mikanko, which, don't get me wrong, was not the majority of the tops, but they are still consistently getting multiple tops every YCS nowadays. So, can be really degenerate. Hopefully this is actually a card that might get hit on the next ban list. Hopefully soon. At the time of recording, obviously it has not come out yet, but I do suspect now that we've had the YCS conclude, it should come out soon, especially because we've hit the 3-month mark. We also have Lightning Storm, completely sided if it was played, similar to the lines of Feather Duster. Just being able to clear back row, or even monsters even, is really nice. It's kind of funny though, because when this was at 3, it didn't see as much as play, at least for the most part from the times I've been doing this analysis. I think this might be the highest Lightning Storm has been placed. I might have to go back, watch my old videos, but nonetheless, I don't think it's that surprising, just because it's quite strong, and evenly matched has actually completely fallen out this time around. I guess for one, let's say something like, as long as your opponent has SP, they can like banish a couple of their monsters and kind of recover after evenly match as well. Unchained, of course, can like really play around evenly very well, and don't really lose out on much, except for maybe some floodgates that they might have sided. And again, something like, let's say like Tearlaments, like you're probably not getting through their Omni Negates anyways, and you're just sacrificing your battle phase, so I can see why Lightning Storm was seeing more play. And then we also have Fenrir. This is another card, speaking of ban lists. Hopefully it gets kind of somewhat of a hit. I believe that it was actually banned in the OCG, someone correct me if I'm wrong. Really good going first or going second, very versatile, and on top of its banish effect, just being a free body can also make the difference in terms of just comboing off for a lot of different decks as well. And then we have Call by the Grave, kind of even split in terms of, being mained or side decked. Always kind of interesting, right? Because, a few years ago when this card was played, it was always just main decked if it was played at all. Nowadays, it's still worthwhile siding it for when you go first and you particularly lose to some hand trap, let's say like Droll or Shifter. And then we also have D-Barrier. Fortunately, this is not seeing a huge amount of play, but 10 out of 45, that's still a decent amount, and it is pretty toxic. You have something like Labrynth that can tutor this out pretty easily, and then you of course have some players running Thrust, although not as much this time around, which we'll get to shortly. This is another card I'm hoping will finally get banned as well. Just lingering Floodgates, not really great. We have enemy control. This has also been, seeing a decent amount of play lately, and it's also a new ultimate rare in the recent OTS pack as well. Of course, if you're going second, it can also be really good in terms of dodging targeting effects, like Imperm or Veiler, just tributing your monster and then take your opponent's monster. On top of that, it can be a really nice plus. Some decks might not be able to really afford that tribute, but for the most part, you should be pretty good. And then speaking of thrust, it wasn't seeing that much play this time around. Last couple of months I've been doing these analysis. It was basically hand in hand in terms of number of play along with talents. But I guess nowadays not much. I'm not sure why. I mean, we have something like, we saw that we have a lot of hand traps being played even now. But maybe because, I don't know, like let's say D-Berry Eradicator is not seeing as much play and it's not as good just because it's... D-Berry, for example, is predominantly really great against Purrely and, like branded, but not many branded decks topped anyway, so maybe that's part of the reason to explain it, but nonetheless, maybe we just see this increase again next time around. And then we also have Super Poly. Speaking of branded, of course, we had a few branded decks that topped. They're usually main decking Super Poly. At the same time, you actually had non-branded decks still play this card because it is very good. And it's actually pretty relevant right now, right? You have something like, let's say, Labrynth. You can get rid of them for Garura. You have something like, Rescue Ace. They are, like, for the most part, fire. You have something like, let's say, the new decks in, like, Fire King. They're also fire and they're susceptible to Super Poly. But more importantly, Centur-ion. They are lights when they try to go into that Calamity Lock, which, of course, once they resolve that, you're probably losing. So Super Poly is very, very good against that strategy as well. And, you've seen some other Super Poly targets lately, like Guilty Gear Feed for, like, SP Barone or other warriors, like, let's say, just Infernoble Knights in general. So there are other options as well. And then we, of course, have Book of Eclipse. This saw a lot of play during when Kashir was tier 1. Kind of saw a bit of a decline since Arise Arc got banned, but you know what? Kind of coming back again. Speaking of Centur-ion, this can also be very good against them as well, just because just preventing them from synchro summoning essentially to get into that Calamity Lock on your turn is really key, and this can be going second a really good board breaker in that sense as well. Some other staples, we do also have Destructive Daruma Cannon. This is a card that is a very popular thrust target outside of Eradicator and D-Bearer, which essentially serves as like a Book of Moon, essentially, or Book of Eclipse rather. It can be really, really strong, and also, of course, you have many Labrynth decks that topped, and they're going to be playing this as well. Cosmic Cyclone, I was kind of surprised this didn't see more play. I thought it was actually quite good this format, but I mean, although more so in terms of catering towards some of the newer deck sets come into the mix, let's say like Centur-ion, for example, being able to get rid of that field spell for that synchro summon can be really key. Maybe the top players did not expect Centur-ion to make like a majority of the top cut. It can also have application against, like, let's say the new deck in Fire Kings as well, like their field spell, their continuous spell as well. So for the most part, I think this can really be relevant against most strategies, like even Labrynth, right? Like on their end, on your end phase, they're probably ditching a furniture and like setting a big welcome or whatever, and if you held on to your Cosmic and on your own end phase you can like banish that, can be really, really good as well. Droplet is another card that at least is seeing more play than like Dark Cooler. Again, we talked about like Mikanko. I get it, they didn't have that many tops, but if you saw my Mikanko survey, pilot survey breakdown, they actually voted this as like the #1 card that impacts their deck the most, because you have something that it's not a targeting negate, and once you negate the Mikanko monsters, they're basically like 0 vanilla monsters, right? On top of that, you could even get rid of like the Acid Golem as well, which is like a really, really big lock on its own. So can be really good against a lot of different strategies. Some decks can, play this a lot better than others in terms of what you have to discard or send from field as costs, but nonetheless, something that you probably won't be surprised if your opponent pulls this on you. And then we have Solemn Judgment, really generic, not much to say about this, especially for decks that lack like an Omni Negate. Going first post side, they'll be able to put this in. And of course, we also have Pankratops, which, is as long as you have like some flex spot, it's an easy side deck option to put. It can really, pop pretty much anything. And on top of that, it's a big body, so you can always attack over SP as well if that is going to be problematic. Okay, so now let's cover some of the more generic extra deck monsters that I've recently started doing, and of course, not surprisingly, we have something like SP Little Knight that was seen in almost every list. Usually lists that are not playing SP is more so that they just can't, right? Like branded lists are a very good example because they're typically fusion locked, and even something like, I guess, like Rika, typically their entire extra deck is just like plant based as well. And then you also have Typhon. This has been very, very popular lately. It's really strong card, and not only that, it also really provides a way for certain decks to out monsters that they otherwise never could have, right? For example, Labrynth against something like Dragoon, that used to be pretty hard for them unless they had like skill drain, but now you can just slap on Typhon and you can just bounce back the Dragoon because it does not target, and you can't like respond with Dragoon under Typhon as well. Really, really strong, and it's just incredibly versatile. Surprisingly, we also have Dark Charmer up here at third. I mean, not every deck can play this. Obviously, you do need a Dark monster, but for the most part, you're probably having some kind of Dark, and being able to revive your opponent's Dark monster, whether to just like attack for game or use their effects, or even just Blink Clam in general, can really come up. This card has been the best Charmer for since release, essentially. And then we also have Zeus. I mean, not too surprising, you know, it is a bit more limited in terms of decks that can actually play Xyz monsters on like something like Typhon, but nonetheless, if you can play any Xyz monsters, you're probably by default adding in Zeus as well, just for that board wipe. And then lastly, we had Anima, which is kind of funny. So this is a card that, you know, aside from Purrely, because they of course have level 1 cats, but other decks like, let's say like Rescue Ace, even Fire King, the new, like the Ponix, for example, is a level 1, and something like, I don't know, like Mikanko also plays this as well. So definitely, you can get punished if you don't put your monsters in the right zones. And finally, let's cover some tech choices that we saw from this YCS, and there were a few, including Gizmeguka, Deck Lockdown, and Denko Seka. So to go through each one, Gizmeguka. So this one's interesting. So basically, the gist of it is, you know, if your opponent special summons from the main deck, you summon this, and then you essentially summon a monster with the same attack and defense, and also the same attribute as a monster that your opponent controls. A little oddly specific, I know, but essentially it summons the Barrier statue. So when I originally saw this first play, was actually start of like 2020, like pandemic period with like Luxury Gaming Championship Series, where they would actually summon this when your opponent summons like that, or rather when your opponent has a Hulk on board, because it's a water, and you would summon like the warrior statue, water statue to lock them. But this time around, they were actually like the fire statue, which I believe Pac was playing, I guess for like Rescue East, I'm not sure. And then there was also a light statue as well. So while you know, we thought Wind Barrier statue was the worst of them all because of Flunder, I guess there are some other barriers that we now have to worry about. I even saw my friend Dylan, who was playing Chimera, he was playing like the dark statue as well, because it's like a fiend that they can dump. So those are things to get, I guess, kind of worry about now. And then next we have Deck Lockdown. So this is not that new. It sees some play every now and then. It's basically kind of like a permanent role, at least, I mean, I guess for the 2 turns or whatever that it's alive. But I actually kind of forgot that you also cannot special summon monsters from the main deck, which is actually pretty crazy. So after you do your entire combo, then you slap this down. Like, it's probably going to be very, very hard, and something not really expected, right? I also want to just highlight, take the chance to say that you can certainly use code Hakuna5 for 5% off on Dragon Shield sleeves. And finally, we have Denko Seka. This was of course seen in Joshua Schmidt's list. So basically, if you summon this, your opponent just cannot activate any of their set spell traps. The exception, of course, would be something like Solemn Judgment that negates the summon. So Denko Seka used to be quite popular back around 2019. Something like Thunder Dragons played this, and even Pendulum Magicians, which was like a tier 2 deck at the time, they also played this because they did not rely on normal summon. So it can be really, really strong. Definitely saw a complete decline in play of Denko Seka. Since then, obviously, it's still not seeing that much play, but at the same time, if your deck is not normal summon reliant, if you're able to summon this, like, it's just a complete blowout. Of course, as you advance through the tournament, if your opponent knows you're on Denko Seka, maybe they like shotgun some floodgates if they have one, but at the very least, that at least reveals the location of where that floodgate is. And let's say you have some kind of back removal, you no longer have to like blind snipe it anymore. So there's some pros and cons to that, but nonetheless can be very, very strong. Anyways, guys, that was it for the breakdown of the most played hand traps and staples at YCS Bologna. Again, a big congrats to Joshua Schmidt for winning the event, as well as all the rest of you for topping this event. A huge thanks to all of you for watching. A big thanks to my patrons, as always, for the continued support. And, well, take care, guys.